All right, guys, Ultra here, coming back at you with another video. Kind of a different video today. I'm previewing the Georgia and Ohio State Peach Bowl college football playoff semifinal game. In this video, obviously, you guys know I'm a Georgia fan. If you've watched any of the podcasts, you probably know because I talk about it all the damn time. Um, and yeah, I love college football. I don't do a ton about it, but I love watching it and I love discussing it. And I just felt it was something that I wanted to talk about with you guys and share with you guys. So, with that being said, this matchup, Georgia Ohio State, one of the most interesting college football playoff matchups ever. For a lot of reasons, and we'll get into that. We'll preview the game, we'll break it down, and I'll eventually arrive at who I think it's going to win and how I think the game is going to go. But before I do that, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more content and like this video. Please leave a comment in the description. And without further ado, let's get right into it. The question everyone has is what Ohio State team is going to show up, because I think we know what Georgia is at this point. Georgia is going to be a team that is good offensively, plays very good defense. We know what we were seeing. They had an off game against Missouri, an off game against Kent State, an off game against Kentucky. They've had some attention span issues, but for the most part, especially in the bigger games, the more important games, they've shown up. We know what Georgia team's going to show up. I'd be stunned if Ohio State goes in there and blows out Georgia. I wouldn't be stunned if they win at all, but I would be stunned if they go in there and beat them by 20, the way they did to Clemson a couple of years ago. I'd be stunned by that. The question is Ohio State. If Ohio State doesn't show up, they're going to get boat raced. I'm just going to say that. I don't think Ohio State can afford, as we saw in that Michigan game, I think it'll go similar to that if Ohio State plays the way they did in that game and they play poorly. Now, the narrative out of that Michigan game is Ohio State just got physically dominated again. Michigan ran all over them, blah, 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 blah. I thought that was the narrative coming out of last year's game, and I thought it was fair. I did not think that was necessarily the case when Michigan beat Ohio State this season, a couple weeks ago. I felt as though Ohio State in that game physically was fine until they started really trying to force a turnover once they got down. I think that was like 31-20, 31-23, around that kind of score. And then Ohio State tried to force turnovers to get the ball back into their offense. And then at that point, also because Michigan hit a couple explosive plays on them in the passing game, they started to try and stop that more, and that got them really tilted away from the run. And then Michigan broke off two huge runs on them that really did inflate their averages. Now, everyone counts, obviously, and you can't minimize that. But I didn't feel, though, as though Ohio State physically got handled defensively the way they did a year ago. And then offensively, Stroud was kept clean pretty well overall. Michigan did a very good job defensively of not allowing a lot of separation, of making plays on the ball, of making CJ Stroud throw in the tight windows. And Stroud didn't have a terrible game, but he wasn't as effective as he's been in a lot of other games this year. So I thought Michigan's secondary was the key defensively in how they slowed down Ohio State. I didn't actually think it was their pass rush. I thought their pass rush was fine, and they negated the Ohio State running game very well, I thought, at least for a majority of that game. But it wasn't as though Michigan was just physically overwhelming Ohio State like they were last year. Not that at all. And if Georgia wins this game, it's not going to be because I think they just physically destroy Ohio State or something like that. Now, Georgia could certainly win the game, and Georgia could certainly out-physical Ohio State, but I don't think it's going to be this humiliation where it's going to look like Ohio State just physically doesn't even belong in a way like the Alabama-Notre Dame game in 2012, for example. That was a physical beatdown humiliation. The Michigan-Ohio State game last year, physical humiliation. This is not that. I don't think it is, at least. So I think we're going to come out of this game and not be talking about physicality. I think Ohio State offensively has a good offensive line. They've played well pretty much all season long. Their guard play hasn't been phenomenal, but overall, their tackles have been strong and big, and they do a pretty good job with edge pressure. And I think Ohio State's got a good offensive line. I think they've got a good defensive line, especially when it comes to pass rushing. And I think Ohio State physically is going to be fine. I don't think they're going to win physically. I think Georgia's the physically superior team here. And Georgia's physically superior to everybody in the country. But I don't think it's going to be, that's not going to be the reason Georgia wins the game, is how I feel on that. The other note out of that game is I'm seeing a lot of comparisons to Georgia from last year to Ohio State from this year in terms of Georgia last year, perfect regular season, flying through it, goes to Atlanta in the SEC championship game against Alabama, and they lost, and it wasn't all that close. It was 41-24 to Alabama, and that game got out of hands late in the third quarter. Ohio State, flying through the regular season, won every game by double digits. They play Michigan, and they just get handled. They get boat raced. And Georgia last year came back, destroyed Michigan, beat Alabama convincingly in the national championship game. They were clearly the better team, and they ended up winning it all. And Ohio State absolutely could come out here and win it all. And I think Ohio State, there are comparisons to be made to that, but I think Ohio State, again, just like Georgia last year, they're going to have to prove it. Ohio State is coming into this game being doubted. They are an underdog for a reason. The line is Georgia by 6.5. It's floated from 6.5 to 7. It's never gotten below or lower than that or higher than that. For Georgia, it's just floated around that touchdown mark, that 6.5, 7 mark. So Ohio State's not expected to win. But Ohio State, I also think, is the more desperate team to win because Georgia's already got the national title. We know Georgia is going to show up in this game, as I alluded to earlier. I would be stunned if Georgia just gets boat raced in the game. I just think Ohio State is the more desperate team here. I think you've got to acknowledge that Georgia's won the national title more recently, and I think Ohio State is going to be motivated coming off of a loss. They're getting another shot here, and I think given a full month to prepare, is going to come out a lot better than they did against Michigan. And the other thing is the media this entire time has been talking about Ohio State and how they have no shot in this game and Georgia's just going to roll them just like Michigan did. Ohio State's going to hear that and they're going to come out and play ball. So I absolutely think Ohio State has a shot in this game. I just wanted to make that clear before I kind of break down the game. But I definitely think Ohio State has a shot in this game. There's a reason, the line's only 6.5 or 7 points in some places. There's a reason ESPN's FPI only gives Georgia about a 58% chance to win the game. So basically, just under 6 out of 10 times if these teams played, Georgia would win. There's a reason why statistically Georgia's the better team, but it's not huge. Ohio State can win the game is what I'm trying to establish there. Let's start with what Vegas thinks, then we'll get to what my model thinks, and then we'll get to what I think and how I'll break down the game and predict it. So Vegas has this game right at 6.5 for Georgia, minus 6.5 in favor of the Dogs. ESPN's FPI has Georgia at about a 59% chance to win the game, so about 6-10. That's decent odds for Georgia. I mean, that would mean Georgia clearly is the superior team, but it's also certainly possible that Ohio State wins the game. That's all that kind of means. As for my model, so I'll kind of explain the model here. It's very similar to, I don't know if you guys have watched College Football Nerds or not. I can link their model explanation in this description because they've made a video on that. I don't want to spend too long on that. But I basically kind of copied their model for this game, but I tweaked it a little bit. So pretty much it's the same kind of finding of the statistics and equating it to opponent averages. So it's a per play model. So I look at your yards per carry, your yards per pass, and your yards per play. I don't use total yards as much because total yards can be skewed by play count and time of possession and things like that, and things that don't really translate to how effective you are, right? So if you throw for 100 yards on 10 passes, that's obviously going to be much more effective than throwing for 100 yards on 20 passes, for example. And so I track you based on that. I track how your defense is played relative to the opposing offensive strength using your opponent rush averages and opponent pass averages. So I find that, and then I find a percentage off of that. So I find your rush defense percentage allowed and your pass defense percentage allowed. Essentially, the lower this number is, the better you are. So 100 is essentially average. but average is not good in this sense because you're playing FCS, you're playing some bad G5s in your non-conference. So the lower you're at, the better you do relative to the opponents you played. And this is basically an opponent adjusted statistic because it's filtering out. If you hold a team to 2 yards per carry and they're averaging 5 yards per carry, that's going to be a lot more impressive. Obviously, you're holding them to 40% of their averages there. Whereas if you hold a team that's averaging 2 yards per carry to 2 yards per carry, that's holding them to exactly their average. So worse opponents actually make your statistics look worse rather than, this can't be inflated by bad opponents. So with that being said, you look at the model for this game. Georgia is allowing 69% of opponent rush averages and 85% of opponent pass averages. So now, in terms of rush averages, Georgia is elite plus, not quite historic. They were historic last season. I believe they allowed about 56%. So they've taken a bit of a downturn this season. I think that's because of some injuries, and they're just not quite as good as they were last season on that defensive line. But nobody really has run on Georgia either. That's the other thing. Oregon had some success, but Oregon's a good running team, and Oregon also got down a ton early in that game, and so Georgia was not playing the run at all, and also was just committing guys a ton to the pass. So, I mean, Oregon's yardage in that game was pretty much meaningless, and then in the Missouri game was the other one where they ran for 4.9 yards per carry, but a lot of that was on one huge run, right? So that wasn't nearly as effective as it looked. It was one missed assignment by Georgia. Not that that doesn't matter, but it's misleading. Other than that, though, nobody has hit 4 yards per carry on Georgia. The next best is Kentucky, who was 3.6, and then Auburn also was 3.7. They would actually technically be the next best. But other than that, only 4 teams have even hit 3.5 yards per carry on Georgia in 13 games. They've played, Tennessee can run the ball well. Florida can run the ball well. They've played some good rushing teams, and they've held them to nothing. So expecting to run the ball on Georgia is a tall task, and it's been a tall task for years. Ohio State's projected about 3.8 yards per carry. Ohio State can run the ball well. Ohio State averages about, 5.5 yards per carry, and that's eighth in the country, but that's not overly effective. That's competent. That's not totally shut down, but it's enough to where you're mostly one-dimensional. I mean, you look at it, that's about what Auburn averaged. That's a little bit more than what Kentucky got against Georgia. And then if you're looking at the Ohio State side of things, 3.8 yards per carry, that's exactly what they got against Penn State. That's actually more than what they got against Iowa. That's actually a little bit more than what they hit against Maryland. So Ohio State is going to hit one of their worst rush averages of the season, according to the model. And 85% against the pass. So Georgia against the pass, 85% I'd consider very good, just about very good even, but it's not elite. I think 80% or below is about elite. The best mark ever is probably 2013 Florida State, who got into the high 60s. And if you can get below 70% for a pass defense, that's just ridiculous. Georgia last year was about 77% against the pass, which is really awesome. But Ohio State's still projected to throw the ball well, about 8 yards in attempts here. So that's throwing the ball quite effectively. That's not throwing the ball at will, but it's throwing the ball pretty effectively. Meanwhile, if we look at Ohio State's defense, Ohio State's allowing 88% against the run, which is solid, but not a ton. That's just not great, is what I meant to say there. Georgia's expected to run for 5 yards a carry in this game. So, 5 yards per carry for Georgia is really what they've been hitting. That's honestly one of their lower marks of the year. They've only been below 5 yards per carry 3 times. That was the Tennessee game, the Samford game, and the Missouri game. And in the Samford game, just throw that one out. That game was literally Georgia half-assed their way through the Samford game, just to be honest there. The Missouri game, 4.7 yards per carry. Georgia didn't run the ball great in that game. And then the Tennessee game, Georgia ran the ball pretty well early, and then when they got up big, all they did was run the ball, so the rush average plummeted because Tennessee was expecting it. And Tennessee's also got, statistically, just a better run defense than Ohio State. But That's the other thing there. So Georgia expected to have one of their worst rushing games of the year and still run the ball effectively. And then passing wise, Ohio State gives up right at opponent averages, 100%. That's not, that's total. They're totally average pass defense. So Georgia's expected to hit about 8.6 yards per attempt, which is throwing the ball at will. So Georgia's expected to hit about 6.6 yards per play. And then if you look at that yard per play number for Georgia, that's a little bit less than what they hit against Mississippi State. That's a little bit less than what they hit against Georgia Tech. That's a little bit more than what they hit against Samford. That's kind of what they hit against Kent State. It's one of their lower production games of the season in terms of a per play sense. But still, 6.6 yards per play is moving the ball really well. It's not moving the ball at elite will, but it's moving the ball really, really, really well. Meanwhile, Ohio State is right at 5.68 yards per play. So about a yard per play worse, 0.9 closer to. So about 0.9 yards per play worse than Georgia. About you can round it to 5.7. Ohio State at 5.7 yards per play. That's literally what they hit against Notre Dame, right at that number. It's a little bit more than what they hit against Maryland. That's a little bit less than what they hit against Iowa. So, that's significantly less than what they hit against Michigan even, and they scored 23 in that game. So Ohio State is expected to have one of their worst offensive games of the season. Now, the model came out with a score of 37-35, and that's because Ohio State is a more efficient scoring team than Georgia. Because Georgia plays this style of offense where they're very efficiency based, and they don't play a ton of possessions. Ohio State, because they throw the ball more, is more based in that scoring efficiency, high volume. When they go off, they can really go off. Whereas Georgia is kind of more consistent offensively, I feel like, but they don't really go off in the same way Ohio State does in terms of just 60 points on you, the way Ohio State's done at times this season, like the Wisconsin game, for example, or the Indiana game. So because of that, Ohio State does have better scoring efficiency numbers in terms of translating yards into points. So that creates a closer game, but it still gives Georgia the edge. Georgia's predicted to win 37-35 according to the model. So now let's get into how I think the game's going to go. So for my prediction here, I think this game, it really is going to boil down, a lot of it at least, to the Ohio State pass offense versus the Georgia pass defense. And I think if we think about it, we know Georgia's going to stop the run. Nobody ran on Georgia this year effectively, consistently. Nobody's run on Georgia really in like 4 years. So expecting Ohio State to have a ton of rushing success in this game and win the game that way is just unrealistic. I'm going to be honest. Georgia's run defense is just too good for that, and they have been too good for that. I'm not saying Ohio State can't have a little bit of success, but to expect them to just run over Georgia in any way is totally unrealistic. Not with Jalen Carter and that front seven that's geared to stop the run effectively, and they've done that all year. I just look at it as Ohio State does like to throw the ball. That's just the truth of it. I think Ohio State, looking at it, is going to have some success throwing the ball, and I think they are the best passing attack Georgia's played. I look at it, Georgia, and the only passing attack that you can really compare to Ohio State in terms of strength of who they've played would be, to me, Tennessee. And I don't think it's Oregon. I think Oregon's got a very good passing game. I don't think they're on Ohio State's level. I don't think Tennessee is quite the same builds in the passing game as Ohio State. Tennessee is very basic in their passing offense approach. They either run a curl route within 10 yards or they'll run a downfield post route to try and burn you over the top. That's very easy to defend. Now, it's not easy to defend when you've got Jalen Hyatt because Hyatt's so good. But when you've got Georgia here and you've got a defense with Keely Ringo and Kamari Lassiter and Chris Smith and Malachi Starks, and you've got these guys that play their roles well, you're not going to give up plays like that on a consistent basis to such a basic passing offense, especially with Kirby Smart and Will Muschamp and Glenn Schumann coordinating your defense. It's just not going to happen. Ohio State is much more complex and much more intricate, and they're just overall a more complicated scheme in terms of their passing game, and they run a lot more routes. So it's going to require a lot. It's going to require if Georgia's able to do what they did to Tennessee to Ohio State, it'd be even more impressive to me. And I know Tennessee statistically 9.8 yards per attempt to 9.4 yards per attempt. They're a better passing attack statistically. Just overall, I think Ohio State's actually tougher to defend for a Georgia. Ohio State with Harrison, who I think is the best receiver in college football, with respect to Jalen Hyatt, with Julian Fleming, with Emeka Ibuka, with even Cade Stover, who's come on for them at tight ends, and with some of their running backs out of the backfield that Ryan Day loves to use. Ohio State's got, and with, of course, C.J. Stroud, a Heisman finalist quarterback, Ohio State's got the guys to stress you out defensively in the secondary like we saw LSU do. I mean, LSU has a really good set of receivers that once they got Nussmeier in the game, they were throwing the ball well. Now, I don't know. I don't really think that has much bearing on this game, but I'm just saying I think Ohio State is going to be a tougher matchup than Tennessee is for Georgia's secondary. But Georgia's secondary athletically, I think, is built to handle the speed and the separation ability that the Ohio State wide receivers have. You know, Keely Ringo and Kamari Lassiter, they're put in tough positions, but especially Lassiter, he hits a lot. And he's able to jar the ball loose. He's able to make pass breakups. Drew's got one of the best secondaries in the country. I'm not going to overreact to that LSU game. And if there is a defensive mind that is able to slow down Ohio State's passing game, it's going to be Kirby Smart. I think we're going to see a lot of what Michigan did. And I think we're going to see Georgia not allow a ton of separation. And I think we're going to see Georgia try and force pass breakups and just overall force CJ Stroud to throw into tight windows. The other thing, though, is CJ Stroud is a runner because he doesn't run. He has some open running lanes and he just chooses not to. And when you're able to get pressure on him, he's very skittish in the pocket. That's probably my biggest knock on him. He struggles a lot with pressure. And Jalen Carter is going to get keyed in on this game by that Ohio State offensive line. So Georgia's edge rushers, it's going to have to win their matchups. And I think they can, but I also would not be shocked if they don't because Ohio State has got some legit tackles. So I think Ohio State is going to have a lot more offensive success than Tennessee has. And that doesn't mean Ohio State's going to win the game, but I think that's going to happen. But I also don't think they're going to go off the way they've done at times this season. Like I think Ohio State is going to score high 20s, low 30s. The question is that going to be enough to win the game? And I think the matchup in this game, the reason that Georgia is going to win the game, and I'm picking Georgia for this reason, I think Georgia's offense is going to win them this game. They kind of won them the SEC championship, and I think this is the game that's tailor-made for them. You look at Georgia's offense, I don't think they get nearly enough credit for what they've done this season. Last season, they were really awesome in efficiency metrics, but they didn't feel quite as talented as they do this season. I'm just going to be honest. Stetson Bennett is playing with a lot more confidence, and he's been the best big game quarterback in college football this season. Georgia's got a cast of running backs that are playing better and running more effectively than they did last season, and I think they'll be able to maintain that in this game. I think Georgia's going to run the ball well in this game. And if Georgia's able to run the ball well in this game, which I think they're going to be able to do, as I just said, I think they're very hard to stop because Georgia, with a consistent running game, it opens up the entire passing game. But Georgia this year, more so than last year, can pass without the run, as we saw. You know, they didn't run the ball great against Oregon, and they just totally destroyed them in the secondary. And that was in the same stadium as this game is going to be played in. Brock Bowers is a mismatch. Darnell Washington is a mismatch. Now, Ohio State's been very good against what this passing profile for Georgia is built up on, which is running backs and tight ends. But A.D. Mitchell is coming back, and I think that guy who took over the national championship game last year is going to be the key to the game in terms of how well Georgia passes the ball. And I think A.D. Mitchell, we're going to be hearing a lot of his name called by Chris Fowler come Saturday. I'm just going to say that. I think A.D. Mitchell is going to be key to this game. Obviously, Ladd McConkey is the Georgia leading receiver this season. But A.D. Mitchell, I think, is their most talented guy and their most explosive weapon. Arian Smith, another guy that's had some injury issues, but when he's been on the field, when he's been healthy, he has been good for an explosive play. Like you look at the Tennessee game, coverage bust there. Arian Smith, 49 yards. Georgia in business offensively, and that kind of broke up in the game for Georgia offensively in that game. Uh, Ohio State, with some of the coverage busts they've had this season, specifically later in the season, against Michigan, against Penn State, against Maryland, I'm a little worried about how they're going to be able to defend the Georgia offense in the game, and that's why I'm picking Georgia. I think Georgia's got the best offensive line in college football, them or Michigan for sure. I think Georgia's got as good of a running back stable as anybody in the country, and they're probably a more effective run offense than anyone Ohio State's played, including Michigan. They're just as effective as Michigan in the run game, statistically at least, on a per carry basis. I think they're a better passing team than Michigan is. I think Georgia offensively is built to score on Ohio State with pretty consistent effects here. So I think Georgia wins the game. My prediction for this game, I think Georgia is running the ball effectively. I think Georgia is throwing the ball effectively. I think they're moving the ball. I think Ohio State is moving the ball with their passing game. And I think they shocked Georgia a little bit to start. I think the game's close. And then I think Georgia gets a couple key stops. They adjust at halftime. And Georgia's offense kind of wears down Ohio State a little bit. And Georgia hits one explosive to an AD Mitchell. And that kind of breaks open the game for Georgia a little bit offensively. And then I think Georgia settles in really well. And then I think Ohio State just isn't able to counter the way Georgia is. I can totally see Ohio State winning the game, but I think with how Georgia is built and with the matchups favoring Georgia for the most part, along with the fact that Georgia has a championship DNA, that I think if there is an adjustment that needs to be made and if there is something that needs to be fixed in the game, within the game, I have a lot more faith in Kirby Smart and Todd Monken and the crew of defensive coordinators Kirby has between Schumann and Muschamp than I do in Ryan Day and his offensive coordinator and Jim Knowles. I'll just say that. I think Georgia's the better coach team in this game. I think Georgia, they don't get a lot of penalties. The one thing Ohio State could take advantage of is Georgia has turned the ball over a lot. So if there are turnovers in this game, that's likely going to be coming from the Georgia side, and that is going to be huge because getting short fields against the Georgia defense is going to be huge for wearing them down, like Alabama was able to do in the SEC championship at this level. That's the one game Georgia's lost in 2 years. It was when Georgia's defense got weared down by Alabama's offense because they were turning the ball over offensively. I just look at it, though, as I think Georgia's offense is going to be able to settle in and be consistently effective. And I just don't see Georgia's defense allowing another Alabama 2021 happening to them in a game of this magnitude. And I just have more faith in Georgia in these big games. I know Georgia's going to scale them out and they can win these big games. They have a championship mentality. They have a killer instinct. I don't know that about Ohio State yet. And I think combine that with all of the schematical edges Georgia has and the matchup advantages Georgia has, and I'm going to pick Georgia to win this game 42-31. I think Georgia wins, and I think Georgia covers. And as a parting piece to you guys, as my parting shot, I guess you can say, I think Ohio State and Georgia, the winner of this game, the Peach Bowl, the winner is going to win the national championship. I really do. I think if Georgia wins, they're going to open as about a touchdown favored, I would say, against Michigan. And that would, obviously, they would be favorites to win that game. They destroyed them last year. I would pick Georgia in that game. That would be close, closer than last year at least, but I think Georgia would win that game. And Ohio State, the confidence they would get from beating a Georgia, I think would spur them on to win the national championship. I think the winner of this game is going to win the national championship. I'll say that. But I just think Georgia is going to be too much for Ohio State to handle for 4 quarters. And I do think Georgia is a bad matchup for Ohio State from an offense to defense perspective. And I don't think that some of the matchups Ohio State can exploit in Georgia's secondary is going to be enough to overrule that. So I'm picking Georgia to win the game. Let me know who you guys think is going to win the game. I'm super excited for this one. This is going to be probably one of the most excited I've ever been for a football game because these teams have not played. I think they played once, and it was in the 90s, and Georgia won the game a long time ago. So these teams have been elite for years, but not they've somehow avoided each other. And we're gonna see two Titans at war here in Atlanta, and I can't wait for it. So please make sure to subscribe to this channel and like this video for more. And with all that said, God bless and go dogs.